So our political party system overall is, according to scholars, a two-party system. It's one of the most important things about our system. But also, the party system in the United States is, the party organizations themselves are fairly non-hierarchical and decentralized compared to other party systems. The Claremont Democrats, for instance, do not take orders from the National Democratic Party, and the National Republican Party doesn't control what happens at the local level with the Republican parties. It's very decentralized. There isn't any kind of staffing or anything like that at the local levels. And this is quite a bit different than you'll find in other countries, political party systems in other countries. Now, when you talk about our party system, you have to think about how party works in government. And from this perspective, we think about how elected officials themselves, when we say party in government, we mean elected officials who are elected on a party label, and how they use that party label. Now, this is characterized by fairly candidate-centered elections. In other words, parties do not control elections, candidates do. And again, that's quite a bit different than you'll find in other systems. And it's also very different than was happening here in the 19th century when parties did control elections. Through a series of reforms, we have weakened our political parties to a certain extent. And this is, a lot of students are kind of surprised that we say that our parties are fairly weak, because they just saw this presidential election and all of the discussions about how the political parties were sort of calling the shots behind the scenes and things like that. It's actually not the case. The fact that they were trying to get involved from behind the scenes suggests that they're so weak that that's kind of what they have to do in order to have an effect on things. And so let me talk about some of the reforms that we've had. So for instance, the first set of reforms, civil service reform, making it illegal to give jobs to political supporters. This started at the federal level in 1883 and then made its way down to the state and then the local level later. And it was combined with the secret ballot in the beginning of the 20th century. The secret ballot was not put in place in order to ensure the privacy, of voters for the purpose of having privacy. It was put in place in order to weaken the parties, so that parties wouldn't know who you voted for, and so they could neither reward you nor punish you for your vote. So this was a way of really making patronage reform stick. Primary elections started to be used in the 20th century, in the 1940s, and then another major set of reforms in the 1960s. And in a primary election, voters pick the candidates that will be running on a party label. Prior to that, party officials chose the candidates. This has had an enormous effect on the party. What it means is that the party organization doesn't really have any control over what people do who actually get elected. It's the voters that then that they end up being responsive to, and not the party. And then a further set of restrictions around campaign finance that made it very difficult for political parties to collect and actually distribute money directly to people running for office. They do certainly collect an awful lot of money, but they're limited as to how much they can give directly to somebody running for office. And with Citizens United, this actually has shifted it again, even maybe away from candidates and toward interest groups, so that parties again are being cut out even more from the system. Let me just contrast this very quickly to the UK. In Great Britain, the party organization does pick the candidate. And so if you are going to run as a member of parliament, as a conservative, you have been selected by the party officials and sort of given permission and being put on the ballot by them. And nobody else can run on the Conservative Party ticket. And that means that if you get into office and you decide you don't like something that your party is doing, they can actually remove you from the ballot next time. They can say, well, we're going to run somebody else instead of you. So that makes people in office extremely responsive to the party. Also, when somebody runs for office in Great Britain, they don't collect their own campaign money. The party does collect all of the money and then distributes it to people running for office. So these are reforms that made our system quite a bit different than some others that you'll find. It also produced a situation that one might describe as loose discipline. And this is partly what I was just referring to. When elected officials are deciding whether to support legislation or not, certainly they would like to support legislation that their party puts forward, and they'll do that only on condition that it's going to help them get reelected. So if their constituents are not happy with legislation, a piece of legislation, they feel pretty free not to support it. And there's not very much the party can do about that. So this is what we call conditional party government. So a recent example of this is the debate over the reform of the healthcare system. And the Republicans passed a bill, or proposed a bill called the American Health Care Act. And the Republican Party leaders are struggling to get enough Republican votes to pass it. Now, one would expect that because the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, as well as the presidency, that it would be a piece of cake for them to pass a piece of legislation. But it's really not, because one group of Republicans say they're not going to support it because it's gives too much stuff away to poor people. That's the Rand Paul and Ted Cruz group. And they are responding to their constituents. That's what their constituents have articulated. And then there's another group of Republicans who are very worried that their constituents are going to be losing their health insurance, and essentially that they will be punished at election time if they support this legislation. So this is an example of how conditional party government can work in our system. Now, the party officials, elected officials, have become more polarized also. This is another aspect of our current party system. Let me just show you how this looks. This is a chart that's in your textbook. This is the House of Representatives, 1952, 2012. These are votes cast from liberal to conservative and what the party was of the person who cast that vote. And you can see that there's stuff in the middle here, and there are also even some overlap. Over here, nothing in the middle and no overlap. it's a good illustration of how polarization has happened. Elected officials, the ones who have been elected and sent to Congress, are casting votes that are both more liberal and more conservative, and they're not making decisions that overlap with people from the other party very much. Now, if we ask why this is, why are we getting more polarized elected officials, there are three kinds of answers that could be given. You could either think about the history, or process, or the electorate itself. In terms of history, one of the explanations that's been given is coalitional sorting. And this is the stuff that we were just talking about. The fact that there aren't any more Dixiecrats or progressive Republicans because of this coalitional sorting. And if you go back to this chart right here, like these Democrats right here, we might call them Dixiecrats. They were probably Southerners who got elected as Democrats, but they're extremely conservative and really act more like Republicans. But it wasn't clear to everybody the parties were still organized that way in the South. So those people have gone off and maybe they've retired or whatever, and other people decide to run from the South. And if they hold the same set of views, they're going to run as a Republican, right? So that's kind of what we refer to as coalitional sorting. And same thing has happened in the North. There aren't really very many progressive Republicans left either. Now, another explanation is what we call geographic sorting, which is reflective of the fact that, Democrats have tended to move into cities and Republicans have tended to move into rural areas. And this has meant that in many districts, the balance is so lopsided that it doesn't matter who actually runs from a particular party is going to win. I'll show you some data from this. These are counties in the country where the margin of victory of one party was more than 20%. And you can see over time that has increased very dramatically. So all of these areas in the West and the Midwest, where Republicans won with more than 20% of a margin. And then you can see in the cities and along the coast, that's where Democrats won by very large margins. And so when that happens, it means that whatever their views are, whoever is Republican is going to end up winning. It might also mean that, we have communities that are so homogeneous in terms of their political views that they end up self-reinforcing each other's views. Now, another set of reasons has to do with process. One reason that's been given is a redistricting, which is the process of drawing maps. I'm going to come back to this later because it appears later in your textbook in the chapter on Congress. But primary elections are another way in which polarization has been enhanced. And I'm going to talk about some of these terms first, and then I'll come back and talk about this issue of primary elections and why this would happen. Another reason that's been given is that the people simply themselves are polarized, and so that they've elected polarized officials. So we'll look at some data about this and talk about it in a minute. So let's turn to the electorate then, those voters, right, and see how party in the electorate looks. Now, we talk about the voters. We usually distinguish between three different kinds of voters. strong partisans, weak partisans, people who are, again, registered for a party, but they are not very active, leaners, party leaners. These are people who do not register for a party. Maybe they check no party preference, but they always vote for one party or another. And so we call them leaners. Sometimes we call them closet partisans. For some reason, they just don't want the label, right? And then we have true independents. These are people who did not register for a party, and they also really always shift back and forth from one party to another. This is not somebody who almost always votes Republican and then casts one vote as a Democrat for a Democrat, or the other way around. This is someone who, often is voting for different parties, and it's a fairly small percent of the population. And then we have the group of people who are not registered to vote at all. And usually, a lot of times when people are talking about these different characterizations, they forget about this group. And it's actually the largest single group. We do have a lot of people who are not registered. And let me just show you how this data looks. This is a chart that represents the votes cast by the voting age population altogether, and the votes cast by registered voters. Okay, now I'm going to scroll down. You can see the United States here. Here's the U.S., right? We have a really large gap here. And you could ask the question, why is that gap so large? Well, first off, we're pretty far this way in terms of the blue. Now remember, the blue is the percent of votes cast as a percent of the entire population. Now, one of the reasons that there are probably three reasons that you could say that might be really low. One is that a lot of people decide not to vote. They decide not to register and not to vote because it's somewhat difficult. There's hoops you have to jump through, and there's really not very much payback. It's not very much benefit to voting. And so the cost-benefit analysis often works in favor of not voting. Now, you might think to yourself, living where we do and like we do, that it's easy to register to vote. How could someone say that it's hard? Well, let's just contrast it to France. In France, when you're born, you are put into the voting database. And when you turn 18, you receive a card in the mail that says, okay, you can vote now, and your polling place is XYZ. And you don't have to do anything. You show up and your name's on the roster and you vote. It's quite a bit different. And so any little additional cost to the cost-benefit analysis for voting does have an outsized effect on whether people are actually going to vote or not. Another reason that the blue dot might be pretty far to the left is because we have large groups of people who actually are in the population but are not allowed to vote, either felons or people who are not citizens. And we have a larger group of that than other countries do. So if you look at this number here, the percent of registered voters who vote, we're actually doing really well on that, right? The percent of registered voters who vote. And that's because if somebody goes through the trouble of registering, it's pretty likely that they're going to end up voting. So we're up close to more than 85% of people that vote who are registered. Now, in terms of the party registration, these are some numbers that you should just be familiar with enough that you can recognize the relationship between them. In the U.S., there are more people registered for no party than either of the other two parties, and there are more Democrats than Republicans. California is kind of an outlier in two ways. We have more Democrats than anything else, and we also have a lot fewer people who choose not to register to vote. So we're kind of bucking the trend of the country on those two things. And then you should also be familiar with San Diego. San Diego had been for a long time one of the coastal counties that's Republican. In California, inland counties that are rural counties are mostly Republican, and coastal counties are mostly Democratic. San Diego for a long time was one of the Republican counties, and then in 2008 shifted to the Democratic Party. 2012 pulled about even. 2016, now there are more Democrats than the other two. So San Diego's been somewhat volatile, and party activists have been paying attention to the city for that reason. To the county, I should say. Now, thinking about party in the electorate and how it shows up correlated with other descriptive characteristics is important in understanding how party works in our system. So, for instance, party and race. We know that there's a strong preference among whites toward the Republican Party, and African Americans toward the Democratic Party. And this is one of the essential divisions, most important and most effective division that we have. And it's grown in recent years. Gender is also an important dividing line, and sometimes we refer to this as the gender gap, but it's less important than race. So you can see, for instance, that women overall vote Democratic more than Republican, but white women just very slightly more. So race is more active in that. Same with men. White men voting much more Republican than men in general, the larger group. Another factor, or three other factors that have been noticed in the recent election, this is data from the election, religiosity, age, and education. Let me just quickly play this video about this.
American voters have grown more racially diverse, better educated, less religious, and older. These shifts have reshaped both the Republican and Democratic parties, but in different ways. Non-whites are increasing as a share of all registered voters, and this increase has been more dramatic among Democrats than Republicans. The non-white share of Democratic voters has increased 18 percentage points since 1992, while the non-white share of GOP voters is up just 6 points. Americans are better educated today than in the past, and levels of education are rising fastest within the Democratic Party. The share of Democratic voters with a college degree is up 16 points since 1992. Meanwhile, the share of Republican voters who are college graduates has risen 3 points. The fastest growing religious group in the U.S. does not identify with a religion at all. It is those who are religiously unaffiliated, calling themselves atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. While the share of Republican voters who are unaffiliated has increased 6 points since 1996, the share of Democratic voters who are unaffiliated is up 19 points. The U.S. has grown older in recent decades, but this is especially true of Republican voters, who are now significantly older than Democrats. Since 1992, the share of GOP voters ages 50 and older has risen 20 points, compared with a rise of 6 points for this age group among Democratic voters. On most measures, the demographic changes transforming the nation have had a more pronounced impact among Democrats than Republicans. The result is two political parties whose voters look less alike today than they did 25 years ago.
So these are important trends in the way that party affiliation works in our society. Another issue that's gotten a lot of attention recently is whether voters are growing more polarized along party lines. And there are different ways of measuring this. The case for polarization among the electorate is not as clear as it is among elected officials. And part of the reason has to do with how difficult this is to measure. So one way to measure it is to talk about a division between liberal, moderate, conservative. You ask people, are you a liberal or a moderate or a conservative? And then you track that over time. What you see is that there's not very much evidence that that has changed very much. Let me just show you this chart right here. This is liberals here, moderate and conservative, and the lines, haven't really changed very much. There's not very much indication that that's a source of polarization, or a good way to describe it, I should say. Another way to think about this is the increasing number of people who have consistently liberal or consistently conservative views across a wide range of policy and values questions. Now, and fewer people who have mixed answers to these kinds of questions. And one could argue that there is some evidence of increasing consistency, meaning sort of moving out to the outside of the political spectrum. Let me show you some data on this. The way that the Pew Center, this is the Pew Center that measures it this way, looking at answers that are consistently liberal answers given by Democrats and consistently conservative answers and given by Republicans, and how that's changed over time. Let me just show you the interactive really fast. So they moved from, in the 1990s, a point when they're very close to the middle, these two. And the shape that you saw here was almost more like one mountain, to the point where now we have the median Republican and the median Democrat are pretty far from each other. And it's almost like a two-peak mountain range. So the parties themselves, in the 1990s, when there was a single peak and they were closer together, the parties were fighting over this, what we call median voter here in the middle, because that's where most of the voters were. But now that the voters have moved farther apart and the middle is not as occupied, there's reason for the Republican Party to shift its platform that way, and for the Democratic Party to shift its platform that way, to look for the median Democrat and the median Republican. So there's some explanation in the in the data for why the platforms are moving out, and you can see that in the actions of the voters. Another way to think about or to operationalize the term polarization is to talk about the negative views of the other party and how much that has increased. And we do see this development. Rising partisan antipathy. So this is data from 1994 to 2016, and the question was, do you hold an unfavorable, that's this line, or very unfavorable view of the Democratic Party? And the percent of Republicans that hold an unfavorable view went from 21% to 54%. I think it says 58% actually. So that's a pretty dramatic change. And Democrats also had an increase, not quite as much, from 17% having an unfavorable view of Republicans to up to 50-something%. And so this, obviously, this greater willingness to say that they're something unfavorable about them suggests something pretty profound about the way that the way party identification is working in the electorate right now. Now, of course, the people that are answering these questions are not the group of unregistered voters. These are the people that actually cast votes for Democrats or cast votes for Republicans. Another way to measure this or to think about this is to ask voters if they think we're more polarized and to see if those numbers have increased. And here are those numbers from 2009, and now we have 88% and 84% of Republicans saying that yes, indeed, we are more politically divided than in the past. So whether we are or not, this kind of a number certainly is going to produce some kind of a self-reinforcing mechanism. The other thing that we certainly see is a frustration with political parties. If you look at this data here, this is, the question is, the Democratic Party makes you feel, and these are some negative answers like frustrated. And if you are a Republican, of course, you're frustrated. It makes you feel frustrated. But also, if you lean Democratic, if you're one of those Democratic leaners, 36% of those feel frustrated with the Democratic Party, and 13% of registered Democrats feel frustrated. You see similar numbers with the Republican Party and Republicans. Does the Republican Party make you feel frustrated? 40% of Republican leaners feel frustrated, and 33% of Republican registered voters feel frustrated with the Republican Party. So there are suggestions for how one might reform the political party system in the current context. And a couple of goals that one might set out are making parties more useful for collective accountability, maybe less frustrating. It might be that voters feel frustrated because the parties are not responsive to them. Another goal might be to make the parties less a source of animosity, maybe less scary. And three kinds of reforms might be, could be talked about here. One reform is to simply make it easier to register and to vote. More people participating in the process might encourage more people to feel like they are being responded to. Another possibility is what we call a top two vote getter open primary. And let me just talk for a second about what a primary election is, make sure we know. These are the types of elections and the average turnout that we have in these different elections. Presidential election, that's every 4 years when we elect the president, and those turnouts are around 55%. Midterm elections are the ones that come between the presidential elections every 4 years. And turnout in those races is significantly lower. It's about 40% of the eligible electorate. Primary elections, though, those are elections that are held to choose the candidates who will be in the general elections, in the presidential or the midterm elections. These elections are held anywhere from, February to the summertime, and only about 10 to 15% of the electorate turns out to vote for those. So it's a fairly small part of the electorate. And what scholars have found is that the people that show up for these elections tend to be the most polarized and the most active of the voters. Now, how can primary elections then lead to polarization, and why would changing primary elections lead to less polarization? Well, let's assume that in a district, several Republicans are going to run for election to the same seat, and it's going to be in a district that is overwhelmingly Republican, right? Let's assume that in this district, 70% of the voters are Republican and only 30% of the voters are Democratic. Now, if only about 15% of the people turn out in the primary election, probably 10% of them are going to be strong partisans, and 5% of them are going to be weak partisans and independents. And let's assume that there's one Republican who's a moderate, one who's more conservative, and one who's very conservative. And there's also a Democrat on the ballot, okay, in the primary election. Now, the votes that are cast in the primary voters, by the primary voters, include 30% for this person, 10% here, and 55% for this very conservative Republican. Now, in the standard rules of primary elections, this person moves on to the general election because they won more votes than anybody else. So they're the winner. Now, they're the choice in the primary election because the people that turned out to vote are the strong partisans, the ones who are more conservative. And so they have a preference for this very conservative. But one could reasonably assume that at least sometimes the preference of all Republicans would be quite a bit different. So if all Republicans had turned out instead of only 15%, it might be that they would have a preference for this more moderate candidate. And let's assume that 55% prefer that more moderate candidate, 35% prefer the more conservative one, and only about 10% of the overall Republicans support this very conservative candidate. Those are the strong partisans. It doesn't always work out that way, but let's assume that that's the case. Well, even though 55% would have liked that person, they're eliminated in the primary. And the winner turns out to be this one, right? Because in a standard election, you're going to have one person from each party, there's going to be one Republican and one Democrat. So this Democrat, even though they only got about 5% of the vote, they're going to move on to the general election against the Republican. Now, obviously, then, this person is going to win in the general election, and they're going to become the representative. But let's assume that you had the general election based on the preference of all the Republicans. You had it based on the no, not the preference of all Republicans. Let's say you had a general election results after you have a top 2 vote getter primary. I forgot what I was talking about. In a top 2 vote getter primary, going back to the primary votes, the top 2 vote getters move into the primary, into the general election. And in this case, it would be this guy and this one. And there's not going to be a Democrat on the ballot because they won so few votes that they don't move into the general election. And so the 2 that are going to move into the general election are these 2. And then this one ends up winning. And you can see that it makes sense for this person to win because they actually represent more of the voters. But they just didn't turn up to vote in the primary election, right? And so a top 2 vote getter primary can allow that kind of a situation to happen, where a more moderate candidate actually ends up winning in a primary where a very conservative or an extremely liberal candidate won the primary election. And so that's why some political scientists have suggested that top 2 vote getter primaries might be helpful in reducing polarization. We did that in California. We adopted the top 2 vote getter primary in 2012. So we've had a couple of races since then, and we've had races in which, sure enough, there is not a single Democrat or a single Republican on the ballot. The top 2 that advance are from the same party. And it's a little too early to tell still, but it does seem to be the case preliminarily that this has it resulted in some instances where more moderate candidates end up winning elections than they would have under the standard primary rules. So this is very interesting to political scientists, and it might be a way of moving past some of this animosity between the parties. Another possibility is, sorry, getting back to my thing up here. Another possibility is ranked choice voting, changing our voting method to another way of picking. And Maine did this recently. They shifted to this. It's sometimes called the alternative vote. It can also sometimes be referred to as ranked choice voting. And I'm going to leave you with a video that describes what this means and how this would work.
Queen Lion of the Animal Kingdom is displeased. She recently introduced elections for the office of king using the first-past-the-post voting system. While her realm started out as a healthy democracy with many parties running candidates for king, it quickly devolved into 2-party rule, with the citizens not liking either one, but trapped within the system because of a problem called the spoiler effect. However, one of Queen Lion's subjects from a distant land, Wallaby, has a solution: the alternative vote. What's the difference? To find out, let's follow one voter on election day, Red Squirrel, under both systems. There are 5 candidates running for king, 2 members of the big parties, Gorilla and Leopard, and 3 other candidates, Turtle, Owl, and Tiger. Under first past the post, Red Squirrel gets a ballot where he picks just one candidate. Red Squirrel really likes Turtle and even campaigned for him. However, he knows that his new neighbor, Gray Squirrel, is voting Gorilla. And what, starts to wonder Red Squirrel, about all the other animals? Who are they going to vote for? The debates on the Animal News Network only had the big parties, so Red Squirrel thinks it's going to be a close race between Gorilla and Leopard. While he's indifferent toward Gorilla, he's deathly afraid of Leopard. Because he can only pick a single candidate, he gives his one vote to Gorilla in hopes of preventing Leopard from becoming king. This is strategic voting, and it's a necessity under first past the post. But now let's look at the alternative vote, which Wallaby explains to Red Squirrel. Instead of picking one and only one candidate, he can rank them in order of his most favorite to his least. He goes into the voting booth and gets the same ballot as before, but now puts Turtle as his first choice, Owl as his second, and Gorilla as his third. He dislikes Leopard and Tiger equally, so he stops filling in his ballot and drops it in the box. At this point, Red Squirrel doesn't care exactly what happens. He has other things on his mind and he heads off. But you, dear citizen, want to know how the votes are counted, so here goes. Turtle, beloved though he is with some of the citizenry, comes in last place with only 5%, and he is eliminated from the race. Because the voters rank their candidates in order, we can know what would have happened if Turtle didn't run. Without Turtle, voters like Red Squirrel would have picked Owl instead, so their votes are transferred to her, as though Turtle was never in the race at all. This is why the alternative vote is sometimes called instant runoff voting. It's able to simulate a bunch of elections where the least popular candidate is eliminated after each round, without all the time and expense it would take to run a bunch of campaigns one after another. The alternative vote method keeps eliminating the least popular candidate until someone either wins a majority or only one is left. As no one has a majority yet, the next lowest candidate, Tiger, is eliminated. Tiger voters listed Leopard as their second choice, so she gets Tiger's vote. In the last round, Gorilla is eliminated. Gorilla voters listed Owl as their second choice, so Owl gets those votes, wins a majority, and is crowned king. The alternative vote is a better system because it produces winners that a larger number of voters can agree on. While the alternative vote does have its flaws, it's important to note that any problem AV has, first past the post also shares. They're both susceptible to gerrymandering, they aren't proportional systems, they can't guarantee a Condorcet winner, which math geeks hate but there isn't time to explain here, and over time they both trend towards 2 parties. That being said, alternative vote has a huge advantage that first past the post lacks and makes it mathematically superior. No spoiler effect. Imagine one final election. 2 big candidates are running, Gorilla and Leopard and Leopard looks set to win 55 to 45. But then a third-party candidate, Tiger, enters. Tiger manages to convince 15% of the Leopard voters to back him instead. Under first past the post, Gorilla now wins, even though a majority of the voters didn't want him. Under the alternative vote, because all Tiger voters put Leopard as a second choice, Leopard still wins because a majority of the citizens of the animal kingdom would rather have her in charge than Gorilla. Using the alternative vote, citizens can help support and grow smaller parties that they agree with, without worrying that they'll put someone they don't like into office. After examining the differences between them, Queen Lion decrees that the alternative vote is to be the rule of the land for electing the king, and everyone is happier. Well, almost everyone. The two big parties can't be as complacent as they used to be, and need to campaign much harder to convince their voters to support them. This has been The Alternative Vote, explained by me, CGP Grey. Thank you very much for watching.
So like I said, Maine, the state of Maine adopted AV just this past election cycle in 2016. It was on the state ballot, and it's a very interesting experiment. We'll be watching to see how it works out for their state.